John Coffey is a securities law professor at Columbia University. He joined us now from Columbia with his take on this news. So welcome, Professor. Thanks a lot for joining us.
My pleasure.
And first of all, and this is a question that's come up frequently over the past year or so, who regulates the regulator? If AIG doesn't like a decision that has been made by the New York Fed, what recourse do they have?
Well, AIG really was indifferent if the federal government was going to pay this money, whether or not its counterparties got 100% or 80%. The really explosive fact in these emails is that AIG was itself trying to negotiate for discounts or haircuts from its counterparties. And that's somewhat inconsistent with Mr. Geithner's testimony that it was impossible to do this because AIG was attempting to do this. Nonetheless, from the securities regulation standpoint, this information is not inherently material to investors in AIG. It's very important to Congress. It's very important to the public. It would have been politically explosive that you were paying counterparties 100% when AIG wanted to pay less. But it's not important to investors who are seeing the government take over 80% of the ownership in return for their bailout. So it's not material information necessarily, but it is interesting, very interesting, that we have the banking regulators doing the same thing they did in the Merrill Lynch Bank of America case by trying to repress information that would have told the market much more about the reality of the conditions at AIG.
I mean, was it just self-preservation on the part of the New York Fed that it didn't want the public, as you say, maybe not material to shareholders, but certainly there's been a lot of public outrage over AIG. So was it just the New York Fed trying to save its own skin?
This was a little bit before that outrage peaked. I think this is just fits the traditional pattern. The SEC and securities regulators have always disagreed with banking regulators about the importance and centrality of full transparency. Banking regulators do not want the public to know who's being bailed out, who's getting the money, and who might otherwise be in trouble for fear that it will spread panic.
So, and in this case, indeed, we had this pushback between the SEC and the New York Fed. Now, as someone who knows about securities law, does the New York Fed ultimately have authority in this sort of case? Did the SEC have any recourse?
The SEC has authority over securities regulation, but again, it's not clear that whether the parties were getting 100% or 80% was at all material to the shareholders of AIG. They had already been replaced to the extent of 80% by the federal government, and whether or not various debtor creditors are being paid in full or in part doesn't really affect the status of the shareholder in AIG. It was very important political information, but I'm not sure it's material to shareholders.
What about material to the broader market? If this information had gotten out, do you think that it would have intensified a panic?
I think it would have been politically explosive because I think it's very hard to tell Congress that billions of taxpayer money, some $27 billion, in fact, was going not to AIG, an American company, but right through them to foreign banks and Goldman Sachs. That would have created a political firestorm.
Do you think Tim Geithner needs to come out and address this once again since there's so much talk about it?
Well, remember, no one has shown that he was involved in this specific decision about disclosure. Disclosure issues are normally debated by lawyers and not by the chief executive of the New York Federal Reserve. Nonetheless, I think we're going to see a continuing political dispute here, and it's going to be central because Senator Dodd has announced his retirement. He is trying to leave behind a monument financial reform legislation. That's going to require that he strike compromises, and to strike a compromise in terms of giving authority to the Federal Reserve, I think he's going to have to get a sense from the Federal Reserve and from banking regulators generally that there is greater accountability and greater transparency. This is a development that does not help the passage of financial reform legislation.
Okay, John Coffey, securities law professor at Columbia University. Thanks for your time, Professor. Appreciate it.